Hey folks, Nathan here from Star Wars Beyond the Films, the Star Wars Timeline Gold, and the Star Wars Reports Rebels Roundtable, bringing you a look at the core rulebook for the third and so far final role-playing game for Star Wars from Fantasy Flight Games. This is the core rulebook for Force and Destiny. Of course, this is basically picking up where the beta rulebook left off, has a few tweaks in it, and is certainly much more expanded, both visually and content-wise, compared to what we got in the beta a while back. It's a $60 book. No surprise there. Gives us a nice little introduction, of course. Gets us into how to play the game when it comes to the core mechanic, the dice pool and whatnot. Interpreting it, using it for storytelling. We get, of course, into our character creation, and among other things, you're probably interested in some new aspects. One being morality. Okay, we had obligation back in Edge of the Empire. Age of Rebellion gave us duty. We have morality, which includes emotional strengths and weaknesses here, that I actually think is much more interesting from a storytelling standpoint than what we got with obligation and duty, because this actually has triggering moments, triggering events, and can help lead to someone becoming a light side paragon or falling to the dark side, which drastically deals with changes in the story. So you could actually craft stories based on character morality. We then, of course, have 8 different species here that they give us information on so that we can build our characters if we're not using other resources. We have Saurian, human, of course. We have Keldor. We have Mirialan. We also then, a couple pages later, have Nautilins, Togruta, Twi'lek or Twi'leks, and Zabrax. And of course, as we get into our specializations, we have the Consular, with the ability to be a healer, a Neman disciple, or a sage. Then we have the Guardian, with the ability to be a peacekeeper, protector, or Sorasu defender. We have the Mystic, where you could be an advisor, Makashi duelist, or seer. We have the Seeker, where you could choose to be an Ataru striker, a hunter, or a pathfinder. We have the Sentinel, where you could be an artisan, a shadow, or a Xian expert. And we have the Warrior here, where you could be an aggressor, you could be a Shicho knight, you could be a starfighter ace. Okay? Then you can get into things like your motivation with your ambition, cause, or faith. That could be part of that, which I think was kind of neat. And then lots and lots of information about various skills and talents that you can use. That brings you then into gear and equipment, which, honestly, a lot of the gear and equipment this time is pretty basic. It's very generic. It's less about specific pieces of equipment, more about types of equipment, so you can sort of use generic versions of these. There's also, of course, plenty in other source books that can be used. Not a big deal here. You get into a section on conflict and combat, very similar to what we see, of course, in the other core rule books. We get into starships and vehicles, somewhat generic, but not as generic as the gear. This also deals with vehicle and ship combat, all in this same chapter. That then finally brings us out of that into our chapter that is probably the most interesting, or one of the most interesting, which is the Force. Okay, chapter 8 here. Gets heavy into sort of the philosophical aspects of the Force, how to play with it. Has some kind of neat little sidebars here that are basically retelling the tales seen in the Mortis trilogy of Clone Wars episodes, that sort of messed up, screwing up its own continuity trilogy, where the third one didn't seem to follow the rules of the first two. It does try to give us a reason for why somehow killing the father weakened the son, even though the son wanted to kill him in the first place. Still not much of a concrete answer, but it's there. And then we get into the Force Power trees. You've got a Force Power tree for Battle Meditation, one for Bind, one for Enhance, one for Foresee, one for Heal/Harm. You have Influence, Misdirect, Move, Protect/Unleash, Seek, and Sense. That then goes into a chapter on the Game Master. I do find a couple things interesting in here within this chapter, or I guess within this chapter and the next. We have this interesting section here, using the Star Wars Expanded Universe. Basically a rundown of how the Star Wars Expanded Universe had about 35 years of great materials to use. Use it or not at the Game Master's discretion. It's about having a fun game. That you don't necessarily need to tie into Star Wars canon or Legends or whatever. Just do what you want, but if you're going to adhere to one continuity or another, it might be nice as a game master to tell the players which you're going to try to follow. I figured that's kind of in keeping with the philosophy we're sort of seeing here. There is Legends material in this book. There's not a lot of canonical material in this book, but some of it is referenced, or referenced in stuff that's in Legends and canon, such as the Clone Wars and whatnot. We're seeing Fantasy Flight Games more and more now, even though they've built their games a lot on the Legends continuity, starting to add canonical elements, like the Ghost being a ship that'll soon show up in X-Wing. It seemed like they're going for more of like what they're doing with the video games, where things get run through the story group for authenticity, but not necessarily to be in one continuity or another. It's like they're trying to walk the fine line between continuities here. We'll see that again here in a moment, and I'll give you what I think is probably the analogy that springs to mind for me when that happens. Great info here, though, to help the Game Master in their role. It's probably the toughest role of all of the roles in trying to do any role-playing game. You have a chapter on the galaxy, so I guess it's the one after this. That's the other example I was going to give you here. It's got information about the state of the galaxy, the different hyperspace lanes, a cool map of the galaxy, and then gets into brief notes about individual planets before giving us sort of a gazetteer of planets, including Moraband/Korriban, which they say basically is Moraband to the outside galaxy, but the Sith called it Korriban, trying to explain the weird name discrepancy because Lucas came in and said, gosh, I want a name that sounds like Korriban but isn't because it's mine. We'll call it Moraband for no effing reason. Back in the Clone Wars. That gives us the Jedi and the Sith. And this is an interesting chapter because it threads that line between Legends and canon, because they really want to give all kinds of great detailed background to the Jedi and the Sith, and there's tons of it in the Legends continuity. But canon has virtually none at this point. Crap, what do? Well, you give tons of Legends information about the different schisms and the Krath and the Jedi and the stuff in Dawn of the Jedi and Tales of the Jedi and the Old Republic MMO, etc., but you preface it by basically saying, yeah, the Jedi history is so muddled because of how much has been lost that who knows what's true and what's not, and what stories are exaggerated and what's true, etc. You know, many tales have been told of the Jedi and the Sith, but the truth about their origins and early adventures has yet to be revealed. The tale within this section should be treated merely as inspiration for game masters and players who want to use this material to establish a deep history for their character's universe, and should not be treated as canonical truth. Yes, that's right. Once again, covering their butts. It's kind of like they were planning on making this as their third RPG, and we're really going to delve into the Jedi and the Sith and their history and all that kind of stuff, kind of like the old Dark Side and Jedi source books did back with Wizards of the Coast. But then came the canon announcement, which all of a sudden dashed a lot of that stuff from continuity and said it's just Legends, not canon. I'm reminded basically of Han Solo and Chewbacca in The Empire Strikes Back, right? I'm trying to get us out of here, and you pull both of these, put it back together right now. Well, here it's more like, what? We're trying to make an awesome source book about Sith and Jedi for Force and Destiny, and you pull all this stuff out of continuity? Put that shit back into our repertoire right now! Yeah, they don't quite know what the heck to do, so they, again, thread that fine line. And it goes a little bit into the history, goes into different Force traditions, though actually not nearly as much on different Force traditions as I would have expected. Presumably that's another source book at some point. We then have Adversaries, a relatively short, quick little chapter on different adversaries that can be used within the game, including some Force users. And then we get our, see, there you go, from Rebels, so canon's in there to a degree. Then we get our one short little adventure here, which is Lessons from the Past. I actually thought this was kind of interesting. There's not a whole lot to it. Basically, the heroes are called to a university where there are some artifacts that have been discovered or being cataloged, and they follow information from the artifacts and whatnot to an old Mandalorian Wars era Jedi ship called the Sanctuary that is out in space where it has been sort of kind of drifting. And while they're there, the idea is that they're going to eventually try to find themselves a Jedi holocron. And it's assumed that you would use this and then the one from the Game Master kit that will help them get their hands on what's needed to build a lightsaber as your way of building up your characters very quickly early on towards being able to use the traditional Jedi accompaniments like a lightsaber, like a holocron. Although it does give you the option of just giving them a lightsaber within part of this story. And that pretty much wraps it up. I mean, we're talking about a massive, massive tome here. A great starter book. I mean, again, I love the way that Fantasy Flight Games worked in the narrative dice as opposed to just regular dice mechanics. So I always find these very enjoyable. In this case, I think this is probably the one I was more excited about, the most interesting of the ways of playing, because it really gets into what makes Star Wars unusual, which is the Force, Jedi, Sith, and so forth here. So for $60, if you are planning to pick up a Star Wars role-playing game for Fantasy Flight Games, if you haven't picked up any of them, I would suggest this one. If you're just looking for one in general, but again, this is a more Force-based one as opposed to the more Empire versus Rebellion one of Age of Rebellion, or Outskirts of Society one with Edge of the Empire. I definitely think you will enjoy it and get something out of it, and of course, if you want to play Force and Destiny, you will need this core rulebook, so you may not need my advice anyway.